sensitivity warning. Video contains flashing lights and screen shake. Full disclosure. This video is based on a review copy provided by the developers. Special thanks to Iced Cactus for co-writing this review.
At its core, BIRDCAGE is a decent little shmup. It's fun enough to dodge the bullets and shoot the enemies. It has incentives to play more riskily, a compelling aesthetic, and great music. However, everything it tries to do beyond the basics feels either shallow, unpolished, or both, which unfortunately includes its primary gameplay hook. The hook in question is the sword mechanic, which has a few different behaviors and functions. Tap the button and you'll fire a sword in a straight line. Hold it, and it'll do a quick spin around your ship before setting into place in front of you and acting as a close-range melee weapon, which deals higher damage than your ranged shots, builds more hypermeter, and scores more points. While held, it'll automatically lock onto the nearest enemy, angling itself toward them. Or, using the right analog stick, you can override the lock-on for manual aiming. It also absorbs any blue bullets it collides with, clearing up screen space, building hypermeter, and scoring some points. The sword is powered by your special meter, which ticks down with each instance of damage the sword deals until it runs out and breaks, requiring a moment to recharge before being used again. Releasing the sword button before the sword breaks will launch it toward whatever it's locked onto, dealing a few hits to any enemies it passes through until it exits the screen. This is clearly inspired by Treasure's 1998 classic, Radiant Silvergun, one of the most beloved entries in the shmup canon, where pressing all 3 attack buttons at once will see your ship pull out a sword, which acts as a short-range, high-damage weapon and builds your hypermeter by absorbing color-coded bullets. It even does the same circular flourish maneuver when it comes out, so it can be used to quickly delete any immediately nearby pink bullets. Given that BIRDCAGE has an option to make its sword behave more like the one in Silvergun, changing its direction based on how you move your ship rather than the right analog stick, it's clear the devs are fans. Unfortunately, this comparison is unfavorable for BIRDCAGE, as its sword lacks many of the nuances of Silvergun's. In Silvergun, absorbing pink bullets is defensively powerful, and hypers are strong, but once the hyper gauge is full, the player has to expend it before they can use the basic sword again, including to absorb more bullets. Used at the wrong time, hypers will cut you off from one of your highest DPS weapons, leave you in a bad position once they end, and disrupt your color-coded enemy chaining, which screws up your score and can throw off your route substantially. As such, you can't mindlessly pull out the sword every time you see a pink bullet. Each one demands you think about whether you absorb it or simply dodge it, a question complicated by how difficult dodging them can be when combined with other threats. This is on top of the leveling system, which sees your 3 weapon categories, composed of 2 shot types each, getting individually stronger based on how much you score with them. You need to stay on top of not only your chains, but which of your weapon groups you're scoring them with. And the sword is composed of and contributes to all 3, so overusing it can spread your XP too thin. And of course, there's the complexity of controlling the sword itself. It first emerges from whatever direction the player last moved in, meaning you necessarily have to move toward whatever you're immediately attacking, increasing the risk of getting hit. It can also be tapped in a rhythm to rapidly slash for high damage at the cost of not getting the full flourish. When held, moving it will cause it to swivel around the ship in the opposite direction, which has all sorts of potential uses if managed well. The sword has an immediate cool factor, but there's substance beyond that surface. And keep in mind that, as mentioned, Silvergun has 7 weapons, and weird enemy chaining, and a leveling system. Treasure didn't just make one cool, complex weapon and call it a day. The sword is only one part of an extraordinarily complex game. The BIRDCAGE sword, on the other hand, fails to be anywhere near as interesting. The game gives up the 6 other shot types, leveling system, and complex chaining, playing more like a cave game with its fast wide shot, slow focused shot, simple chaining, and hyper system. So the formula is simplified down a lot, and you'd hope that means all the complexity has been redirected into the sword. But no. It's got way less depth than in Silvergun. The sword cancels bullets, but blue bullets aren't very common, and rarely are they much of a threat. Deleting blue bullets gives score and hyper, but too little to be useful. You get almost all your score and hyper through damage. whereas in Silvergun, dealing damage and building hyper were separate actions that you had to choose between. The sword has different states based on whether it's tapped or held, but the tap function is mostly only useful in boss fights, since most things won't be in a straight line ahead of you. And in boss fights, it becomes too good, doing more damage and building more hyper than your cannon if you can line it up, which isn't hard against most bosses. The sword deals higher damage than your basic shots in exchange for range, but all it really asks is that you get modestly close to the enemy, then lock-on will handle the rest. This thing reaches way further than the Silvergun sword too. You can also continue to use the sword even when your hyper is full, so there's never a reason to hold back. Whereas Treasure was very invested in the idea of making the player let up on the fire button pretty often. Most confusing of all, despite the fact that the sword is the fastest way to build hyper, the hyper itself can only be used to power up your basic shots. You would think, in a game about having a cool laser sword, inspired by Radiant Silvergun, that your hyper would be like the one from Radiant Silvergun, where said laser sword turns giant and does this big AoE crash in the middle of the screen. But no. During hyper, the sword button ceases to do anything, and your ship automatically and invincibly fires its cannons instead. All you can control is whether it's a wide shot or a focused shot. Why? It's literally called Hyperblade mode. I thought this was supposed to be the cool sword game, not the game where the sword is a stepping stone to your true power, pressing X to go beast mode. So we've lost most of the complexity of Silvergun and replaced it with nothing. And unfortunately, all of BIRDCAGE's mechanics are a similar story. There are many other games you can play which have swords, not just Silvergun, some of which don't even market themselves as sword games, yet have far cooler and more interesting swords. Zero Ranger has 4 different melee weapons, and all of them have more depth than the BIRDCAGE sword. Hop on, like, Lilac Zero or something. Or Altenex Second? What the fuck is Altenex Second? This wouldn't be such a problem if not for the concessions made to make the sword work. You might have noticed I said you control it with the right analog stick, which means you need to play on a modern twin-stick gamepad to get the best experience. In fairness, you can play on an arcade stick, or a leverless controller, or a keyboard, which is my preference, and the sword's lock-on will do a decent job offensively. You can clear the game fine enough on your controller of choice, but you're sacrificing a lot of fine movement and defensive utility by playing on anything without 2 sticks. And clearing the game fine enough isn't good enough for score play. So unless you're about to bust out your Virtual On controller, you'll be stuck on gamepad. Which is unideal, because that means movement is bound to either the D-pad or the left stick. The D-pad is theoretically the better choice, but I find D-pad a bit uncomfortable to use for long, so I tend to use the stick. Which leads to a small but unavoidable bit of imprecision. You can customize your dead zone, which is nice, and they generally did a good job making analog feel good, but I would prefer the precision of digital movement on a keyboard over the imprecise granularity of full analog. And personally, I think twiddling 2 thumbsticks constantly feels awkward and bad. There's a gradation in your movement speed based on how far you tilt the stick, which is nice. Most shmups don't have that. But the reason they don't have that is because they're not built for analog sticks. This is compensation for a fundamentally flawed control scheme. This is to say nothing of if you have some particular disability which makes playing on a gamepad more difficult, or just don't own a gamepad. We're giving up a lot of control customization for the sake of this sword mechanic, which I'd be okay with if the trade-off were worth it, but it's not. It also means the game would need a custom twin-stick scheme if it were ever put in an actual arcade cabinet, which suggests a certain disconnect from the roots of the genre. Home console shmups do sometimes get arcade ports, so this is a bit of poor foresight. I play Third Strike on stick, exclusively because I might have to play on cab one day, and in-person shmup events are sometimes played on sticks and cabs as well. So this is a genuine, if niche, concern. If anything, all this control over the sword might be removing depth, rather than adding it. The difficulty of getting the Silvergun sword to move how you want gives it implications over the entire game that direct control would negate. Even tapping it for rapid slashes takes a certain rhythm to do properly. Without limitations, the BIRDCAGE sword becomes too simple, and simplicity plus high damage equals dominant strategy. You rarely want to do anything except to hold it up close until it's about to break, and then launch it. Knowing when, where, and how to hold the sword out in Silvergun is complicated, but it's trivial here because of the lock-on. And even without the lock-on, you just have to hold the stick forward. The solution to virtually any problem that you can't line up with your cannon is to launch a sword at it. Unlike in Silvergun, where you have this wide variety of weapons that all have different ideal angles and ranges, and lots of stage hazards to navigate around. That game turns the 4:3 aspect ratio, as opposed to the traditional vertical, into a mechanic in the way that this game doesn't. Stage hazards are, here, a gimmick the game quickly discards. Apparently the decision for BIRDCAGE to be 4x3 was made very early on, so it's odd that it ended up being such an unimportant element. Just another Silvergun reference without much motivation beyond being a Silvergun reference. This game doesn't really have a reason to have an omnidirectional attack. There's not even a level where you move sideways, and blue bullets rarely come in from below. And for some reason, the coolest shit in the game, angling the sword launch to destroy multiple enemies in a row, doesn't award any more points than the typical stick and poke. So there's no incentive to do anything interesting with it, or make any crazy sword plays with all this control you have. The sword is ultimately overpowered, even when limited by meters and cooldowns, and never asks much finesse from the player, despite how much finesse is possible, rendering it mindless. That said, analog control is, as the game's built now, absolutely necessary. The alternate sword behavior is both an objective downgrade and feels terrible to control. It moves in whatever direction you move, locks in place if you hold your shot down, and has no homing. So it's much harder to use while attacking or retreating, and landing launched swords is borderline impossible. There's no reason to use this option outside of a self-imposed challenge run. So you either play with the sword being mindless or useless. That is, unless you play on the unlockable second ship, which doesn't use the sword, and instead has homing missiles on the special attack button, and as a bonus for grazing hitboxes. I initially gravitated toward it because the lack of the analog sword meant I could play on keyboard. And then it also turned out the second ship is drastically more powerful and easier to use than the first. It's far safer due to not having to get close. It deals far more damage on average because of the graze missiles. Grazing recharges its special meter for scoring. Its slower speed isn't ever really a problem, and it no-diffs parts of the game that the sword ship struggles with. Particularly these enemy destruction segments, which are important for scoring. Because you can graze off walls, the green ship clears these no problem, even though hazard sections should be where a slower ship struggles the most. Launching the sword as a homing projectile is nice, but you can't choose what it locks onto. It's always whatever's closest. And if the game is going to decide where your projectiles go either way, you might as well take the stronger projectiles. There are a few points here and there where the sword is slightly better, but there's no contest as to which is more powerful on the whole. If the sword ship is mindless, the homing ship is autopilot. All this, combined with the fact you can comfortably play it on a keyboard or arcade stick, makes the homing ship the clear choice. I would almost call that a feature, like a roundabout way of making gamepad optional. Except for the fact that the final boss makes you play as a combined version of the two ships, which has both the graze homing missiles and the sword, and features maybe the only actually kinda difficult blue bullet pattern in the entire game. And if you were playing as the second ship for the whole run, get used to suddenly moving twice as fast, buddy, because the speed is based on the sword ship. So no, there is no combination of options you can choose that avoids being inferior to Twin Stick in some way, shape, or form. Which really means there's just no ideal control scheme in general. Unless you're gonna switch from keyboard to gamepad in the last 5 minutes of the game, which I feel we shouldn't be encouraging. The homing ship is odd to me, because balancing issues aside, I don't understand why a game whose primary identity is its cool laser sword would give me the option to play without the cool laser sword. Surely if someone buys a copy of BIRDCAGE, the sword action shooting game, they're doing it for the sword. And they'll be sorely disappointed to discover that the sword is not only optional, but kind of a liability, given the imbalance between the two ships. Having options is nice, but other shmups have just as many options, if not more, without allowing any of them to opt out of the core mechanics. More importantly, the second ship has an insidious knock-on effect, because now the sword can't be too integral to the game, or else not having it would make it unplayable. I suspect this is why there are very few threatening patterns which use blue bullets, until the one part of the game you're guaranteed to have the sword. It feels like the depth and utility of the sword was sacrificed for the sake of the second ship. And the second ship feels included for the sake of the story, despite the fact that the cost was the game's tagline mechanic. It would have been fine to only have one ship if the sword were complex enough, as is the case with Silvergun. Or, if there was going to be two, the second ship should have had a different melee attack with different properties, similar to Gunbird, which also has far more characters to choose from, and who are differentiated by more than just this one attribute. Give the second ship a big green axe that has a bigger hitbox for deleting bullets but less DPS or something, or which can destroy special green bullets instead. You're making a melee shmup. Focus on the melee. In fact, I would argue the real main mechanic of BIRDCAGE is its hyper system. It's the one thing the two ships have in common besides moving and shooting, and the primary reward for using the sword is, as mentioned, the faster hyper gain. You'll get about twice as many hypers per stage with the sword ship as the homing ship. This doesn't succeed at making the two competitive with one another, but it is a distinction, I'd argue the primary one. If the hyper isn't the main mechanic, then I don't know what is. Moving and shooting? Problem being that this is maybe the most boring iteration of the hyper concept I've ever encountered. Rather than Silvergun's quick sword crash hyper, it much more so resembles the lengthy Doronpachi Daijo style of hyper, DOJ and its successors being the other clear point of inspiration for BIRDCAGE. I'll spare you the labored explanation of just how complicated DOJ's hyper is, but in short, it grants a burst of power in exchange for increasing the player's rank, which makes the game harder, can be stocked multiple times to increase its power and how much rank it gives, can be gained either by dealing damage or picking up certain items, overrides the button you use to bomb, and can be cancelled early by using a bomb, voiding out the rank increase. Or you can get hit, I guess. It doesn't make you invincible. Not for more than like a second or two, even if it does give you some safety. And there's bullet cancels, if you fulfill some conditions. And like, so much other shit too, I don't know. Don't even ask about DFK's hyper. We'll be here all day. In other words, how to build and use hyper is a constant, complicated, important decision for the full length of the game. It has depth, it has meaning. A Doronpachi hyper is fun because it's power with a cost, not just because it's flashy. Though being flashy obviously doesn't hurt. By comparison, BIRDCAGE's hyper is dead simple. You build the bar, you press the button, you get damage and invincibility for a few seconds, and you can cancel enemy bullets with it to get points. There's no difficulty increase, you can't stock multiple of them, you can't cancel out of it, the game has no bombs for it to override, and your meter resets at the end of the stage, so there's no reason to hold it against a boss. When it gets full, it's full, meaning any damage you deal after that is wasting potential meter gain, so it's optimal to press it immediately. At best, you should maybe wait a few seconds or so for a particular wave to spawn in, or for the boss to start a particular pattern. There is almost zero decision-making involved once the bar is full. It is effectively the press X to take a break button, complete with full invincibility, despite the fact that you're canceling enemy bullets anyway. The developers could remove it entirely and reduce boss health to compensate, and the game would hardly change. In fact, it might improve, considering how unengaging it is to actually interact with and use hyper. The only thing it adds is extra incentive to use the sword, but that's already covered by the extra damage and score, and at least hypothetically its defensive utility. It doesn't need the hyper. Granted, that would make the sword ship even worse in comparison to the homing ship, but we've already crossed that bridge. We might as well commit. If anything, that's a subtle benefit of the homing ship, having to interact with this boring system less, and having a ship that feels like it does actual appreciable damage in its base form via the graze missiles, since the cannons on both ships are shockingly weak, basically only existing for the sake of building hyper. I play these bullet hell games to dodge bullets and shoot back, not to plink away with a pea shooter until I have enough meter to stop having to play. This feels like a severe misunderstanding of what makes a DOJ-style hyper interesting, and one which demonstrates the necessity of DOJ's complexity. BIRDCAGE's hyper isn't power with a cost, it's just a power fantasy, and a boring one at that. And as a reward for higher risk play, it fails to be interesting. Compare with something like Devil Blade Reboot, which grants a score multiplier and a difficulty increase in exchange for point-blank shooting, making the game more exciting rather than less. I get the feeling the developers might know the hyper is mindless, because there are a few segments designed to force its use. A couple of bosses have laser cannons that pose a serious threat, but which can be destroyed if you're in hyper mode. And there are occasional rushes of popcorn enemies that are impossible to kill all of without spending hyper, so those are obligatory hyper spots if you're playing for score, on account of the destruction rate bonus. In fact, sometimes those enemy rushes come immediately after a mini-boss with laser cannons, so as to challenge you to beat a difficult pattern without spending bar. These are brutish attempts at making the building and expenditure of hyper more complex. Obligatory hyper dumps that all but force you to press the button at suboptimal moments with regard to safety. But they fail to add complexity, because the choice is still entirely binary. There are still objectively correct and incorrect times to pop hyper. We've just shuffled them around a bit for the sake of making the game slightly harder. What the hyper needs is downsides to make it less overpowered, not for me to less often have it when I might want it. And it must be said, if you're playing purely for survival rather than score, half of these hyper dump moments cease to exist. The lack of complexity in the hyper system is hard to square, considering it's the game's only resource that needs managing. Most shmups, especially bullet hells, have some sort of bomb, or a sub-weapon which uses ammo, or some weirdo shit, like the gems that let you go bullet time mode in Espegaluda. Something which ties not just individual encounters, but the whole game together. Something which interconnects all the various systems so that there's always pros and cons to when you use it, such that your route can change dramatically if you have to bomb somewhere you didn't expect, or manage to get through a tough pattern without a bomb. Because without that, the game becomes a sequence of isolated enemy encounters, rather than a cohesive and dynamic whole. Batsugun is widely cited as the first ever bullet hell, and it not only has bombs, but also a shot leveling system, which encourages leaving enemy and projectile spawners alive to farm them for XP. And games since Batsugun, like Blue Revolver, have a whole complex ecosystem of interconnected resources. BIRDCAGE has no such resource. There are no bombs, and as mentioned, you can't stack up multiple hypers, and any hyper you save until the end of the stage gets thrown out in the next. Not even a point bonus for holding onto it. It's a use it or lose it system, which doesn't have to be a bad thing in isolation. I prefer aggressive games, but with nothing like a stock of bombs to manage, or a difficulty increase whenever you use hyper, the game really lacks anything to make each stage and encounter feel like it meaningfully influences the next, outside of lives, which is a given. The only thing to really do with hyper is plan individual stage routes to max it out more efficiently, which is okay, but it's not much. And the designated hyperdumps mean the thing you're actually optimizing for isn't very interesting. I keep coming back to this word, but it's very binary, very solvable. The early stages get boring because there's nothing to optimize besides score, and all that really matters is avoiding damage. This type of resource juggling, and the ability to play the early stages well and stock up resources to blow through later ones, feels like such a baseline for the genre that it's surreal to play an entry where it's entirely absent. The lack of mechanics and resources to manage also makes item pickups feel like a needless inclusion. Defeating mini-bosses will see them drop a trio of items which you can take one of.
I love choosing between three things! I love choosing between three things! I picked one of three! So true!
But two of these items, the score bonus and the health pickup, are effectively useless in survival play. The third is an extend, which there's never a reason not to take, since a single extend is worth 3 health. Because for some strange reason, this game has a health system, rather than typical one-shot deaths. There is a shield you can get for overhealing, but that really only matters in score play. It protects your enemy chaining, which can get you score extends, but why play riskily for score extends when you can just take an extend? Similarly, you'd never take the points unless you were playing for points. Unless you were right underneath the threshold for a score extend, I guess. It's odd that there's no items that give hypermeter, considering that's an important Dodonpachi thing, but then it's not like you'd ever take that over an extend either. The pickup system is ultra redundant as a result of BIRDCAGE's lack of mechanical complexity. This mechanic is, would you rather have $1 or $2? Because there's really not much else the game can offer you. One might wonder then why there's a choice at all, but it turns out this is another reference. The highly influential 1997 indie doujin game Chōrensha 68K is one you might not have played, but if you've played any shmup made since, you've definitely played something it inspired. There's a ton of Chōrensha DNA in Zero Ranger, for example, both in terms of little visual references, and its core identity as a middle ground between boomer shmup and bullet hell. The main mechanic of Chōrensha is a similar-looking item triangle which drops off of a specific enemy type, offering a bomb, a shield, and a shot level. This is immediately a deeper rendition of the concept than BIRDCAGE, because none of the items are redundant. The choice between the three is always meaningful. These items also appear more frequently, and drop in the middle of or right before danger, so there's a time pressure to choose quickly and not grab the wrong item in the heat of the moment. Where the real sauce comes in is that, by weaving between the items and sitting in the middle for a couple of seconds, you can get all three. The clear optimal nature of doing this is complicated by the sheer difficulty of actually consistently doing it while under fire. It's very easy to screw up and get hit while waiting, or mess up these micro taps and grab the wrong item, both of which can be devastating. You're constantly tempted to go for it, but constantly wary of the danger. Even the best players in the world can't get the triple every time. The Cho-Ren-Sha item triangle is like the platonic ideal of elegant game design. The only hitch is learning about the trick to get all three, but once you know that, it all unfolds in an instant. It's simple enough to understand that a 5-year-old could grasp the risk-reward dynamics, but complex enough to base an entire game around. You probably intuitively picked up on some of the nuances I deliberately didn't explain just by looking at it. The BIRDCAGE item triangle aesthetically resembles Cho-Ren-Sha, but has none of the depth. The decision-making is entirely one-dimensional, and the items always appear when there's zero danger. I learned of the Cho-Ren-Sha item triangle during the making of this video, and figured maybe BIRDCAGE had implemented a similar trick to pick up all three at once, hence the redundancy in the items. It wouldn't make the redundancy good, there would still be an obvious and easy optimal strategy, but it would at least make the design decision make more sense. Redundant items become nice little bonuses if they don't cost you anything. Unfortunately, there's no such trick. I have to wonder why this reference is even being made if the mechanic isn't going to be similar on almost any level. Crimson Clover also has a one-choice item triangle that only appears during safe moments, but at least all three items are useful. It might seem harsh to ask for such a wealth of mechanics from a two-person indie game, but many of the games I've mentioned so far, and many more that I haven't, were made by as many people or less, and most of them didn't have the same credentials as BIRDCAGE's devs. The Doujin Shmup scene, from Touhou to Crimson Clover to Hellsinker, is packed with under-equipped amateurs making great games. Polygon Bird is made up of professional comic artist Yannis Milanoyanis, who's seemingly worked with every big comic company you can think of, and Barry Epoch Topping, a composer who you might recognize for his work on Paradise Killer, which I reviewed favorably a few years back. Or Thatcher's Tech Base, I suppose. Neither, as far as I can tell, have much history with programming or game design, but they're professionals. They should be able to look at a game like, say, Cho-Ren-Sha and replicate some of its complexities. So no, rather than a lack of resources driving the simplicity, I think BIRDCAGE is deliberately trying to be stripped down. And that isn't, on its face, a bad thing. Cho-Ren-Sha itself is a great example. Zero Ranger is too. You can have a good shmup that's relatively simple. You don't always need maximum complexity. Having to control 7 different weapons would already be complicated enough, but Silvergun also has a really intimidating scoring system, it's super long, and it's fucking hard, even at a baseline. It's a semi-polarizing game, despite its good reputation, because it's really demanding and weird. DOJ's Hyper takes so long to explain all of that I didn't even bother, and its sequels take it even further. These things aren't flaws, all good art asks a lot from its audience, but they are things you could trim down and still have a good game if you reallocate that depth elsewhere. But BIRDCAGE doesn't know what parts of the mechanics it's lifting are safe to pare down and which are essential, so it ends up destroying the core and leaving the surface. It doesn't rebuild after deconstructing things, it just takes them apart and then leaves the pieces on the ground. One of those pieces is difficulty. In short, BIRDCAGE is too easy, even on its highest setting. I'm a novice shmup player, I've only been playing these games for a year or two, so I can't imagine anyone but the newest of newcomers having trouble with this game. With nothing to manage and no real decisions to make, there's very little strain on the player besides basic bullet dodging, and even that doesn't go nearly as far as most bullet hells. Stages aren't very dense with encounters, and patterns are pretty basic and easy to deal with, which, to pay the game a backhanded compliment, makes analog movement not as much of a problem as it could have been. The game took me only 10 hours to 1cc on normal, then 5 or so more to 1cc on hard. with both ships. By comparison, Batsugan took me 20, and that was with only one of 3 ships on only one of 2 different versions of the game. Mushihime-sama on original mode, considered one of the easier cave games, took me 40. The only game to ever take me less time than BIRDCAGE is Death Smiles, and that's both a famously easy game and one with extremely modular difficulty, which I of course used to make it as easy as possible. I don't feel like I'm anywhere near done with Death Smiles, let alone Mushi, whereas I feel pretty done with BIRDCAGE after only a week or 2. And even baby mode Death Smiles has some nasty patterns that I had to bomb or hyper my way through. The easiness of BIRDCAGE might sound like a good thing if you're new to shmups and intimidated by the more difficult stuff, but other shmups are better at accommodating newcomers, without sacrificing the depth or skill ceiling. Many games mentioned in this video work just as well, if not better, as beginner games, while also being better games as a whole. Even Daifukatsu, with its billions of mechanics, is approachable on novice mode. BIRDCAGE also has an easy mode, but if anything, it's too easy. So much easier than normal mode, that I can only imagine a beginner getting confident after clearing easy, only to be crushed and scared away by the jump to normal. Blue Revolver, on the other hand, succeeds at being just as easy at the base, harder at the cap, and more fun than BIRDCAGE at all skill levels. I've been making a lot of criticisms and comparisons based on cold, hard facts and logic, but going off vibes, BIRDCAGE's bullet patterns and enemy design feel aimless. If I were smarter, I could put this into words, but if you've played some of these games, you get what I mean. In a good shmup, particularly a bullet hell, you might start off staring at your hitbox, but you eventually zoom out and start to take in the whole screen at once. Patterns go from a bunch of shit all over the screen to, a pattern. Something with a discernible concept and logic that you can and must start to comprehend in its totality. That's when shmups transcend beyond fun and into revelatory. BIRDCAGE never graduates past bullshit all over the screen, and you can and should stare at your hitbox from minute 1 to minute done. Landing sword hits on bosses isn't so much about aggressively pushing forward and dodging through danger, as it is taking free hits in between volleys and then backing off again. The game is playing at bullet hell, but the patterns are giving boomer shmup. And this isn't a deliberate middle ground like it is in, say, Zero Ranger or Rain Chaser. In the words of Jimmy McGee, you never get that Danmaku dancing feeling. Outside of a few spots, and even there it's weak. Toho is hitting you with crazier shit by stage 2. The bosses in general aren't very good, and all I really have to do is show you a sizzle reel of other shmup bosses for you to get why.
Commencing sizzle reel. Return to BIRDCAGE.
At their best, the patterns are serviceable. At their worst, they feel like they're in the wrong game, too fast and all over the place to belong in a bullet hell. They often feel like they're out of sync with themselves and end up not really communicating anything. You have to sight read them every time, and they layer really poorly. Not just that, but bullets from one phase aren't always deleted before the next. So the screen is sometimes more dangerous than it should be, and there's a lot of variance between runs. Compare this with any Toho spell card, which can be expected to behave the same way every time, and you can therefore rehearse and route properly, whereas you can't really route boss patterns in BIRDCAGE. This is particularly bad on hard mode, where there are not only more bullets, but the bullets all move faster too. This is a really dangerous thing to do. There's a reason not many games play with faster bullet speeds based on difficulty. And if they do, the game is balanced around that max speed, then nerfed for the lower difficulties, with a ranking system that dynamically moves you up or down based on your performance. Not designed for normal difficulty, and then arbitrarily increased for hard. My generous read for why the game has a health system is that it makes the game appear more approachable without needing to actually make it easier. But my cynical read is that the game is so obviously full of random deaths that you need triple the lives you'd get in a better balanced game. It's giving Euro Shmup, honestly. During one run, I suicided twice in a row to get score medals, and I still came nowhere close to a game over. I didn't even get one of the score medals. It's one of those weird, paradoxical games best summed up as, it'd be bullshit if it wasn't so easy, which turns into just plain bullshit on scoring runs. I'm getting nailed by random stray hits on stage 1 all the time, and I don't think that's because I'm just that bad at video games. Call that a scrub quote, but I've played much, much harder games, even ones explicitly designed to encourage point-blank shooting, where this doesn't happen, and I largely credit hard mode's increased bullet speed for that. This makes certain bosses borderline luck to get through without taking damage. Particularly the stage 4 mini-boss, which is so much harder than everything else around it that it's half the reason the 1cc is any challenge at all. Then there's this pattern on the penultimate boss. This one is particularly egregious. It feels like it wasn't even tested on hard mode. The bullets come in so fast that it's pure luck if they happen to land right on top of you or not. You can't react to this. This makes the game wildly fluctuate between too easy and suddenly killing you. Not so much challenging as it is simultaneously boring and frustrating. And being bored makes me die more because I'm not paying attention. I started suspecting pretty quick into hard mode that the game was balanced around normal, because some patterns feel like the devs didn't know how to make them harder and just threw in some extra bullets wherever, like these Darth Maul lightsaber segments on stages 2 and 3, or the stage 3 mini-boss. Whereas good shmups make the hardest version of each pattern first, then remove parts for lower difficulties. So, as you climb up the tower of difficulty, you see more and more of what the thing truly is. More revelatory moments that BIRDCAGE lacks. That was gonna be my evidence. Then, in a dev blog, they straight up said the game is balanced around normal mode. So, chalk another one up for vibes-based criticism. This results in a very odd addition to hard mode, which is this extra mini-boss at the start of the final gauntlet. When I first saw I was missing a boss achievement, I figured there was some super ultra boss locked behind hard mode, or these dialogue choices on the final boss. But no. It's just this. It's hard enough to warrant being a hard mode exclusive, but surely, if you're going to include an extra boss on the highest difficulty, it should be the crazy, over-the-top true last boss that spouts Ikaruga-esque dialogue about God and the nature of man, right? That's how this tends to work in other games, and it's a suitable reward for pushing through a game's toughest challenges. But instead, the TLB is first available on normal mode, and hard only adds in this fight against some walls that shoot lasers? I have two theories for how this happened. Either A, the wall boss was too hard for normal mode, and they didn't know how to rebalance it and make it easier, so it got shuffled away as a hard mode exclusive. Or B, they wanted the TLB to be available on normal, because that's what the game is balanced around, and so normal mode players should get to see the game's proper ending, but then there would be no content exclusive to hard mode, and therefore less reason to play it. So this boss was either cut from the lower difficulties to give hard mode some novelty, or an extra mini-boss was assembled and placed wherever it could fit. Maybe a bit of all these explanations at once. Either way, very messy. Does not feel right. The first boss in the final gauntlet should not be the hardest one, and it shouldn't be exclusive to hard mode. The TLB isn't even very hard. You're giving me all this pretentious text, but what's really pretentious are these patterns, acting like this shit is more difficult than it really is. Just stands there and lets me farm hyper off of it. Now, the last defense for any mediocre or bad action game is to insist it's good, or at least more difficult, if you play for score. And to be sure, many good shmups are made great once you're past survival and into scoring. But any game can be played for some arbitrary metric of success. Bad games don't instantly become good just because they give you a leaderboard. There needs to be a baseline good experience that's enhanced and clarified by scoring mechanics. And those scoring mechanics need to be well considered. And BIRDCAGE's weak core gameplay leads to dull, frustrating score play, decided by obnoxious and oversimplistic metrics. With so few mechanics, BIRDCAGE has little to reward you for doing. All that really matters for score is grabbing all 3 score medals per stage, getting somewhere close to 100% destruction, killing enemies with your sub-weapon as much as possible, and maintaining your kill chains. Namely those last 2. There are a few other small things you can do, like holding a shield until the end of a stage, or canceling bullets with hyper, but sub-weapons and chaining are the overwhelming majority of your score. The rest is pennies. All you're really doing is playing for survival, but really well. Whereas good score systems add weird modifiers that force you out of your comfort zone. BIRDCAGE's scoring sounds bog standard, but once again, the devs try to substitute complexity with strictness. Rather than chains lasting across individual stages, they persist throughout the entire game. Generously, this makes scoring unpleasant. Ungenerously, it turns it into cock and ball torture. Because now the baseline for score play is hitless runs, the least fun thing to do in maybe any game. I know YouTube has brain-warped what everyone thinks constitutes high-level play, but it actually is not normal to give the players zero mistake budget like this. It feels like the devs are making the assumption that high-level play will be super cool without actually knowing what it'll look like, rather than designing super cool high-level play themselves. Now, yes, in theory, hitless runs of any game are going to score better than otherwise. A human being who could play Battle Garega for score while never taking a hit will obviously score better than one who couldn't. That human being doesn't exist, but it is hypothetically optimal. Problem being, BIRDCAGE's game-long chaining takes hypothetically optimal and turns it into the standard, with the other scoring metrics only acting as small gradations between runs. There are world record runs of shmups which have unnecessary deaths in them, but I foresee BIRDCAGE's leaderboard being dominated by no-missers, one of whom just happened to get very slightly more hyper medals than the rest. Even that's obviously not nearly as hard as something like no-missing Garega, but it does turn the game into an exercise in reset syndrome, because forcing absolute perfection means every random hit is equally run-ending. There is a reason that almost no chain games let you carry chains between stages, and why some games use short chain systems that cash out frequently instead of stage-long ones. Because the feeling that you can recover from a bad mistake is crucial to keeping the game fun and dynamic. And yes, hardcore play is still supposed to be fun. The shield system does give a bit of leeway, since losing your shield doesn't break your chain, but you only get 1 item drop per stage. So that's, what, about 6 hits you're allowed to take in the entire game? Chorensha, Batsugun Special, and Devil Blade Reboot are all way less miserly with shields than this. And those aren't perfection or nothing games where a single death is ruinous. Shields in those games are used appropriately to incentivize risky play, not as insurance against losing the entire run in a single hit. Euro shmup vibes. Combine this with having no bombs, and needing to play on hard with all its random high-speed bullshit for the arbitrary point multiplier, and I can't imagine grinding this game for score. That's why I made someone else do it for me. 'Cause I'm fucked up and evil. I got 80 million, and Ice Cactus got 138, both on hard, and neither of us enjoyed the grind. The excessively tight chaining also screws up score extends, because it takes something like a stage and a half of unbroken chaining to get one. So in survival play, where you're taking a lot of hits, they're few and far between, and very inconsistent. Whereas in other games, you're basically guaranteed to get at least 1 score extend per run, and there will be a hidden 1-up somewhere after the halfway point. Score extends here are too rare until you're already no-hitting multiple stages in a row, at which point, you probably won't need the score extends. No 1-ups anywhere, just lightly hidden score medals. Even these feel like they're fucking trolling me, with their random-ass movements and crazy speed, and how they bounce off thin air and change directions at random. The challenge of these should be dancing through a bullet curtain to reach them, not calculating trajectories with my mental protractor. I've played against high-ranked players in Lethal League who didn't hit angles this devious. I'm getting schmooved on like I'm fighting Melee Fox and it's just a goddamn score item. The game-long chaining is a band-aid solution to the game's lack of macro play, a quick fix for a problem created by the developer's failure to expand upon the core mechanics. It's also a case of mistakenly assuming that high risk, high reward is a foolproof scheme for good game design, without regard for what the risk or reward actually are. Staying in the middle distance from a boss to hit with the sword, or grazing bullets for homing missiles, aren't as fun, interesting, or difficult as Polygon Bird think they are. Pressing one button and going invincible is a powerful reward, but it's powerful in a boring way. Playing the entire game without getting hit is hard, but it's hard in an obnoxious way that's a waste of my time, compared to playing something that's just as hard, if not harder, but also more meaningful. If the game were, at the very least, technically rock solid and packed with features, I would say it's a worthwhile package that just needs some iterating upon. Shmups are no stranger to major revisions which overhaul mechanics and stages, after all. If it felt more complete, the game could be something to watch out for later down the line once BIRDCAGE Black Label is out. But BIRDCAGE is surprisingly lacking in polish and content. Take the sword spin, for example. Whereas Silvergun's sword flourish is a proper, clean 360, BIRDCAGE's sword, despite looking similar, is actually just rapidly hitting 6 set points in a radius around your ship, none of which are directly in front of you. It doesn't aim forward until the spin is finished, whereas the Silvergun spin starts at the front, then circles back around. All this janky behavior dramatically hurts its utility as a defensive tool, since half the time, you'll have to dodge the bullets you were trying to absorb anyway. It's usually better to skip the flourish by immediately pushing on the analog stick, even in defensive situations. The homing here actually makes things worse, because the sword angling itself toward the nearest enemy, no matter how far it is, means it'll avoid any bullets directly in front of the ship. The game's tutorial even lies to you about this. It pretends the tap function fires the sword in a straight line, but it actually lightly locks on anyway, if it's within a certain narrow range. Meaning it'll often curve to hit a target, even if you're trying to clear bullets rather than deal damage. This especially happens during bosses, for obvious reasons, despite the fact bosses are where most of the most dangerous blue bullet patterns show up. Why is the hardest place to make safe directly in front of me? I know I said the sword should have more limitations, but these are not the limitations I had in mind. Okay, so I'm here in editing. As I was working on this video, a pretty major change happened in a patch. Previously, if you were aiming the sword manually, lock-on would always override it when you launched it. So you couldn't manually decide where the launch was going to go. This felt really bad, and it didn't seem like it was how it should work. Now, in the current version of the game, you can override the lock-on by aiming the sword before you launch. Problem is that this fixes one issue and creates a different, worse one, which is that now tapping the sword, just holding it toward a boss and tapping it over and over and over, is clearly better than just shooting at them, right? Because I don't think it actually does more damage doing that, but it does seem to build more hyper, and it definitely scores more from my rudimentary little tests. And beyond that, fucking with the balance of the game, it also just feels terrible. Largely because there's no, like, reticle or laser beam that points to where your sword is gonna go when you're pointing it. It just, like, goes the direction it's gonna go. So you just have to fucking vibe it out, and it feels terrible. It feels terrible to be twiddling both the sticks all the time, like I've said. And it also feels terrible that the best way to kill bosses is to fucking do that all the time. So this is really bad. It's a bad change. It turns out that the borked controls from before were actually kind of load-bearing. They were load-bearing in the Krusty the Clown poster sort of way. And now the game's worse. Now the game is worse because they tried to make it better. So that's really not a good sign for the foundations of the design of the game. Back to the script, I guess. This sword circle problem doesn't seem like a bug, because it's impossible not to notice in the tutorial. It also doesn't seem like a deliberate balancing mechanism, because there are moments that feel designed with a proper circle in mind, like the homing blue bullets that come in at weird angles, and can come back for round 2 if not destroyed the first time. There's no way they would make it look like a circle, much like the one in Silvergun, which is actually a circle, and intend for it not to be a circle. Even when just waving it around manually, it snaps from place to place instantly, rather than gliding there. You can see by the afterimage. This makes sense for when you want to instantly angle it behind you, but again, seriously hurts the defensive utility. Unless you're very slowly and carefully moving the stick, you can skip over bullets your sword is passing right through. I understand the delay on a smooth swivel might have felt bad, but this is worse, and at least a smooth swivel would feel consistent. No one gets mad about the Silvergun sword swoosing between the 8 digital directions. Again, this doesn't feel like a bug, but more like a coding shortcut. Something slapped together early in development which was unfortunately never changed like it should have been. But then, early footage makes the sword look like an actual clean 360? So I don't understand why it's like this. Regardless, it makes for a really bad comparison to Silvergun. That's far from the only problem, so let's do a big list of bugs and oversights I and my co-conspirator encountered. We'll start with the bugs, then polish problems, then audio-visual stuff. Here's the outright bugs. Number 1, the score medals are using some kind of weird source engine-ass physics system rather than any consistent behavior. So if they're in a weird spot when they spawn, like right on the edge of the screen, they'll go flying at insane speeds and angles that can be impossible to predict or catch up with. The very first medal in the game does this every time unless you're careful not to blow up this barrel too early. Number 2, the laser enemies on stage 3 sometimes don't fire for some reason. Number 3, the first wave on stage 5 sometimes spawns too early before the stage transition. Number 4, loading the stage 6 mid-boss in training mode has you fighting it on the wrong background. And number 5, your ally doesn't spawn in when you do that either, which messes with routing since he can meat shield for you and deals some damage. There could be more things subtly going wrong, or which neither of us happen to trigger, but these are confirmed. I can understand how these things happen, Lord knows I can't code for shit, but bugs are bugs. Now let's talk about stuff that's probably not bugged, but is rough and shouldn't be in the state it's in, as well as content the game should have but doesn't. And finally, visual polish. This gets its own section because it's surprisingly underwhelming, despite the aesthetic being the game's other big selling point. The 2D character art is nice, Milena Yanis is a skilled illustrator, but there's a real lack of the stuff. There are these Metal Gear style codec calls, but no face or mouth movement, outside of, I think, the occasional blink. No one has different expressions like Snake and the gang did, there's no one pulling their mask off to reveal their face, nothing. The demo for Rain Chaser has more facial movement than this. There's a real lack of motion, even on the big, detailed enemy sprites that really should be animating all over the place. Speaking of a lack of animation, the game appears to have 3D, but there's nothing actually 3D about it. These 3D backgrounds are pre-rendered video files that play as a flat image, and you can tell because enemy shadows just sit on top of it. The player ships, the enemies, and all the bullets are 2D sprites as well. I'm not going to say Game Maker is the wrong engine for a shmup. Zero Ranger was built with it, but it was the wrong engine for BIRDCAGE. Game Maker can't really do 3D, so they're stuck faking it, which looks really bad sitting next to Radiant Silvergun, a game with crazy 3D stuff going on all the time. Same for Ikaruga. Or something contemporary, like Devil Blade Reboot, which has the player ship flying toward and away from the screen during level transitions. This thing BIRDCAGE is doing with pre-renders will also age very poorly, as you'll know if you've ever played a game with pre-rendered assets, especially video. It already looks deliberately low-res with some kind of filter over it. Lower res than even Silvergun looks, and that's a Sega Saturn game. Or look at the Stage 4 boss, who, according to the lore entries, is a giant bipedal mech. But you'd never know that from gameplay, because it just looks like a mass of gray pixels like all the other bosses. Milena Yanis can draw a mecha, so it's odd this is so unclear. Compare this with the mecha enemies in Devil Blade Reboot, which are also 2D sprites, and you'll see how this can be done better. Sit this game next to any pixel art shmup in general and you'll realize it's lacking. BIRDCAGE has an immediate wow factor with its general visual style, but zooming in on it as you play more reveals the trees to be cardboard cutouts. Speaking of trees being cardboard cutouts, check out Stage 5. It starts with this cool Silvergun-esque shot, but then the actual stage itself is just this green background with a repeating tree texture on the sides. Maybe some brown bricks for obstacles halfway through, which is another 4:3 aspect ratio problem. Silvergun was full of environmental hazards, not just to constrain space, but also to make the game look full. whereas this game looks barren. I'm not asking for a Mushihime-sama level of dense forestry, but this is really sparse. The transition to the main stage seems abrupt as well, like there's some kind of effect missing here. And, is that a missing texture in the background? That purple thing? Kinda looks like I forgot to install Counter-Strike Source. Not sure. And the pre-rendered video file means it'll have to be re-rendered if they want to change it. Stage 5 is a particularly bad example of an ugly background, but none of the backgrounds are that nice, unfortunately. Too much green, too little variation, and they don't even do that Shmup thing where one of the stages is one giant enemy ship you fight your way across. And the various 2D hazards across the stages all look pretty bad. Stage 5 also has this terrible water filter effect over its mini-boss that distorts the bullets, as if they realized this pattern was too easy, and instead of making it harder, just made it harder to see. Although, you can cheese it by sitting in the corner anyway, so that cancels out, I guess. And stages 1 and 6 have a blackout gimmick where the screen turns monochrome red. Both of these are not unplayable in terms of visibility, but really not good ideas. There were red bullets in these sections, man. The devs are playing with fire for no good reason, other than an attempt at a striking image which isn't achieved. One of the final mini-bosses also has this seizure-inducing laser, even if you have flashing and screen shake turned down, which is particularly bad on the monochrome background. It's unpleasant for me to look at, and I'm not photosensitive. And most of the final stage has this ugly, flickering fog texture over it. But if we're talking lack of visual polish, we're really talking bullet visibility. Bullets in BIRDCAGE have a habit of hiding underneath one another, leading to cheap deaths. This is particularly bad on the Stage 3 boss, whose most dangerous pattern is rough and random enough without also hiding hitboxes from you. And the final boss repeats that pattern, for good measure. Sometimes foreground objects show up to obscure the screen, even when there are still threats around, so you can get hit by things hidden underneath a foreground object. This happens literally the first time there's a foreground element. Also, these fireball-looking bullets are too wispy and don't communicate their hitbox clearly, and they love to blend in with other bullets. The reset syndrome is bad enough when you're not also getting hit by shit you literally couldn't see. The aforementioned monochrome effect also doesn't help in a game with color-coded bullets. Compare bullet visibility in this game with Blue Revolver, which, yes, sometimes puts a blue bullet on a blue background, but also has extensive options for visual customization, and never makes it unclear where the hitbox on something is. Thankfully, the blue bullets in BIRDCAGE have a consistent visual design which communicates what they are regardless of color, but I can't say the same for the other bullets. This is another vibes-based thing, but the bullets feel like they're all from different games, and they're not very good at communicating their purpose. They don't have no rhyme or reason, but in other games, bullets not only have a consistent visual style, but also a visual language which conveys their purpose. BIRDCAGE lacks this sort of visual clarity, and looking at the dev blogs, it seems like a lot of these visuals, particularly the bullets, were cooked up early in development and simply never revised. These narrow bullets, with the pixel on the end, which are ugly, manage to hide in plain sight and survive through massive changes in art style. These are programmer graphics which somehow made it into the final game. Devlog screenshots also show that the Stage 1 mini-boss is identical to how he was first conceived in early development. I don't expect the Stage 1 mini-boss to be spectacular or anything, but I don't think he stayed this way because he was such a banger fight that he just had to stay, nor any of the other enemies you see in these old trailers. I think that, like the bullets, he was supposed to be iterated upon, but never was. He also demonstrates another visual problem, which is that enemy sprites don't telegraph their attacks at all. There are no cannons on any of these ships. The bullets aren't emerging from anywhere, they're just appearing on the body fully formed. This looks ugly, but it also gives the player too little information about what's happening. This is a game where the main gimmick is up-close sword combat. I should be able to tell when the cannon I'm staring down the barrel of is opening up to fire, but I can't. This, with the higher bullet speed, is a horrible combination. Blue homing shots charge up and have an audio tell, because it'd be particularly egregious if they didn't. But the only other big telegraph I noticed was this one, on the Stage 4 boss's sword. And I don't even think that's very useful. You shouldn't be fighting this boss up close anyway. It helps you know when the projectile is coming, but why isn't the same logic applied to all the other projectiles, where you just have to time it in your head? Yeah, sometimes it's cool to have to feel out the timing without an indicator. We enjoy preemptive play around here, but I don't play Guilty Gear with my eyes closed, despite how it might appear sometimes. There's also no bullet ceiling, which is odd for a game focused around melee. At the very least, I should be able to visually identify where on a boss bullets are gonna come from. This is such a problem that the laser cannons on the stage 4 mini-boss, which you can destroy with Hyper, aren't actually destroyed by shooting the cannons they're coming from, but rather the lasers themselves. You shoot the lasers to destroy the cannons. Compare all this with Batsugan, which, as a reminder, is from 1993. Notice how the stage 3 boss is built to reward point-blank fire, and so when it's about to shoot, the ports on its hands will open up, or the lasers will charge up for a second before blasting. I don't need everything to be 100% reactable, but BIRDCAGE consistently fails to give important information, and looks ugly in the process. Honestly, looking at the early footage, I kinda like the look of it better. Feels more cohesive to me. Also, the shot impacts for both ships are blue, even though the second one fires a green cannon. The little boosters on the green ship's options are blue too. And the text, which reads Halcyon OS Online at the start, doesn't change, even though the second ship is called the Sayix. Bet you didn't think I'd notice that shit, did ya? I question the decision to go with a pixelated art style when Milano Yanis is clearly a more traditional illustrator. There's a little bit of pixel art on his site, but it's mostly comic book stuff, sketchy stuff, the type of cool, edgy cyberpunk business that I'm into. I'd have loved to see more of this, maybe even a whole game that looks this way. Pixel art is traditional for shmups, but there's no reason you couldn't do something more out there. There's not even much art in the unlockables. You get a few logos, a slightly better look at the ships, and some glimpses at extra art by the way of screen borders, but nothing to show off more of the cast's personality, or a look at the world beyond the immediate events of the game. You unlock character bios for the whole cast, and you expect to see a full body shot, but all you get is their codec portrait twice in a row. There's some bonus codec calls for lore, and the characters here don't even have portraits. There are some 2D stills in the intro and ending, but I want more while I'm actually playing, and arcade mode skips the intro anyway. Every cave game has these neat little vignettes of the characters between stages when your score gets tallied. Look at all the fun stuff Rekko and Palm are getting up to in Mushihime-sama Futari. Even Blue Revolver shows you a little cheesecake shot of your chosen character in her pajamas, in case you're a sick fuck who's into that kind of thing. Whereas with BIRDCAGE, you have to go to an external site to see any of the cool stuff, and there's not much of it. Or, and this makes me particularly mad, the full release has a $3 design document DLC. Concept art is like the barest unlockable thing in any game. Upcharging me for that is absurd. I'm not paying for this, even though getting a peek behind the curtain might make my review better. Maybe I could request a code from the developers, but on principle, nobody should be getting nickel and dime for stuff that's supposed to be in the game they paid for. And also, I hate sending emails. This might seem like a minor point, but I love looking at all the extra materials for shmups. I think a lot of people do, considering how much of it is often included with the package. Junya Inoue's art is the first thing that pops into my head when I think of DOJ or S-Braid. If there's one advantage a shmup made by a professional artist should have, it's nice art. And the lack of this stuff makes BIRDCAGE feel cheap. The game lacks aura in general, it's aiming for grit, but is easily outclassed by Dodonpachi. There's nothing that goes nearly as hard as Devil Blade Reboot's
God does not abide by your resistance.
in the first 30 seconds. And more cool, moody art really could have helped with that. I care about that stuff more than I do the story for most shmups, and unfortunately, that remains the case with BIRDCAGE. The devs really want to seem to make this a story-driven thing, what with the MGS influence, but there's not much going for it. I read through all these lore entries and felt nothing, and these are most of what you can unlock. There's not much going for the story in almost any shmup, but the clear desire to do something compelling with it makes it noteworthy here. This feels like a case of OC syndrome, where the author has built up this massive universe and story in his head over the course of years, and now he's putting it on the page and doesn't realize that we, the audience, aren't already invested like he is. We don't have the info that makes it compelling, like what this space tree is, or why I should care about this space war. Too much sequel and lore baiting, not enough here and now. Maybe include a prequel comic or something that sets up these events so the game itself can focus on the protagonists, or vice versa. I have very little sense for the personality of any character, partly because none of them have much, and partly because of the lack of portraits, or any voice acting for the two leads. I typically prefer when indie games avoid voice acting, but I could use a couple character barks to give me a sense for what these people sound like, at least. This is an MGS-inspired game. Some voice work is welcome. The bosses have voice lines, and I think they're fun. Silvergun had a whole voice cast and cutscenes for each stage, and they're all great. Just a little Ikuyo at the start of the level. Come on. Okay, I'm here in editing again because I just now realized this. Why doesn't this game do that thing where you'll have like a cockpit shot of the character and they'll be like making faces and I thought of this because I was playing Raider G, and when you do a bullet cancel, your character does this like smug face, and when you kill a boss, she'll like laugh maniacally. Why doesn't Birdcage have any of that? Why doesn't they could have just done that? And like if they were like the Codex sprites, they could have reused those. It wouldn't have been. Why doesn't this game have stuff in it that it is supposed to have? Like with the sword controls, I could accept the story being unremarkable if not for the concessions made to accommodate it, namely the two ships merging for the final boss. So we're giving up most control methods people use to play shmups in exchange for dramatic climax that doesn't really hit. The low number of ships might also be a limitation of the story, and the desire to let the player see the climax of the narrative feels like the real motivation behind not locking the TLB to hard mode. Arcade mode lets you skip the ship swap on stage 5, but you still have to deal with having an ally ship on stage 6. There are shmups with better stories that don't compromise the core gameplay this much to accomplish that goal. The one thing I can outright praise is the music. If you know Paradise Killer, you know that game had a banger soundtrack. So right about now you're asking yourself, does Birdcage have a saxophone solo? And you bet your ass it does. Two, in fact. The music is carrying this game extremely hard. Any hype moments and aura present come from the music and virtually nothing else. You really don't notice how rough the gameplay is or how undetailed the visuals are on your first few runs, because the music is demanding your attention so hard. If I had to come up with a criticism, I'd say it's a bit too stylistically consistent, if that makes sense. It sort of has that Tekken problem, where each individual track is good, but they're all so similar that they kind of blend together into a soup of high-energy wubs and guitar shreds, much as how the backgrounds are a little too green. Every stage kinda has final stage energy, so there's no room for anything besides maximum hype, making the hype itself not land as much. There's a few daring bits here and there. I was happy to hear the chimp noises, but it doesn't go weird enough in total, I think. None of these are deal breakers, the music is still great, but I could use some down-tempo tracks at least. All that said, the genre is no stranger to amazing soundtracks. This might be pretty high up there, but I would say it's the one part of the game that matches its contemporaries, not which exceeds them. DOJ's Stage 1 track is better than anything in Birdcage. It's gorgeous. Zero Ranger does, in fact, have a sax solo. If I want a sax solo, and a good game, I can play that instead. And that's really the problem. In isolation, I can say Birdcage is okay, and will be a decent 10 to 15 hour experience if they patch up the technical stuff. But I can't recommend it when I remember that a better game at a lower price is one door down. Even in a hypothetical post-money utopia where all art is free, I would still have a laundry list of games that are more worth your time, which have done everything Birdcage does but better. And I'm nowhere near an expert on the genre. I'm also not some kind of old guard shmup guy stuck in his ways. Half the games I mentioned as better than Birdcage are ones I'm playing for the first time for this review. And when I look over my modest collection of Steam ports and emulators, I can't come up with a reason to click on this one over anything else, even if it's not bad when actually playing it. Playing other games to take notes and capture footage for this review, I found it hard to peel myself off of them and go back to Birdcage, knowing it wouldn't be as fun. We can talk romantic about how games shouldn't constantly be compared to one another, but that idea doesn't survive when it hits oxygen. If a shmup fails to have some kind of eternal appeal, it fades away. It doesn't have to be better than every other shmup ever made, but it does have to do at least one thing better than most, and this one doesn't. I've said these names half a dozen times each by now, but if you want something story-driven, play Zero Ranger. If you want an anime-inspired bullet hell, play Blue Revolver. If you want an easy game that's simple and flashy, play Devil Blade Reboot. And if you want a game with a cool sword, play Radiant Silvergun. Silvergun's unique complexities are polarizing, but that also means it's the only game that plays like Silvergun. There's a reason to love it. BIRDCAGE's unique selling point, or to use less corpo speak, its raison d'etre, or to use less French speak, its identity, the thing you might love it for, the sword, was compromised from the start, because the devs were too afraid to confront the audience with a complex core mechanic that they might not like, even if that meant no one would love it either. I might be able to say BIRDCAGE is okay, I don't think it's terrible or anything, but okay isn't good enough, especially in a genre this stacked. And for reference, my co-conspirator is much more negative on BIRDCAGE than me, while being much more experienced with shmups. The sentiment I'm seeing online so far is that all the shmup newbies are super into BIRDCAGE.
This is, if I had to give this game a superlative for the year, I would say this is my favorite game that I'm terrible at.
Actually, you've already given this a great description. It's on the pull quotes in the press kit for this game. It says, "BIRDCAGE is fucking fantastic." Quote, Jeremy Jane /NoClip.
Wow, holy shit. That's why I claimed
You're getting pull quoted.
I'm also getting outed here as only having reached stage 4 in this game.
Wow.
Whereas all the more experienced types who call them STGs are lukewarm at best. Take that for what it's worth. Other genres, like classical survival horror, get away with middling indie renditions that coast on nice vibes because said genre is thin on the ground. Fans don't have many choices. They'll overpraise something mediocre for what it represents, more so than what it is. Shmups do not have this problem, and shmup developers do not have this luxury. These games never went away, and they never stopped being great. It's not only good, but necessary to allow your standards to go up over time. And this genre has benefited from that principle in a way few others have. This video is full of games which prove that point. In a blog post by Derek Yu, who you might know from Spelunky and UFO 50, he gives some advice to aspiring indie developers. He charts games on a scale of broad appeal versus cost to develop. For the most reward, you want something that's cheap and that a lot of people want, whereas he places shmups in the opposite quadrant, with niche appeal and high costs. They're hard games that are all about gameplay, which alienates a casual or story-enjoying audience. And while 6 stages and a couple ships might seem simple, it takes way more time, money, and work than you'd expect. That makes them risky. Even the great indie shmups can't touch a Hollow Knight or an Undertale in terms of sales. Hell, they can't even touch Rain World. Star of Providence is a roguelite, which gives it broad appeal, and it's got a big name attached, and it's still not that popular. But that doesn't mean Derek advises against making shmups. Rather, he warns that any aspiring shmup dev needs to be one of 2 things. Either rich enough to tank the low sales, or a challenge seeker. Someone who wants to make some really good art and push a niche genre forward, even if the work is hard and the rewards are low. And, I would add, willing to deal with just how picky and genre-savvy shmup players are on average. Either way, you have to know what you're getting yourself into. And I don't think Polygon Bird knew. Granted, no one really knows how hard a game is to make until they're actually making it. I'm sure Dambo didn't realize Double Action would take 8 years, and at least hoped he'd make minimum wage off of it, which, unfortunately, he didn't. I'm sure System Erasure thought they'd have Black Onion out by now. But BIRDCAGE, in particular, feels like it was put together without an understanding of just how difficult making a game like Silvergun was, or how smart the people who made it were. There's a Batsugun reference in the credits, but there's virtually no lessons learned from Batsugun here. There are allusions to the great canonical shmups all over BIRDCAGE, but they're only skin deep. Like the developers played them and figured they got the idea, but never really thought about them. I think BIRDCAGE knows it's not as good as any of the games it's inspired by, but I don't think it knows why. It's got the good music, it's got the cool aesthetic, it's got the wide shot and the focus shot and the hyper. Why won't this wooden plane fly? This is the meanest thing I'll allow myself to say, but it feels like arrogance by way of naivety rather than egotism. And being fair, that's a problem a lot of indie games have. I'd also feel more like I was being too mean if not for the fact I think this game is going to do pretty well. The opinions of the type of person who calls shmups STGs only really matters in the long-term artistic sense, not in the short-term sales sense. Probably not going to do huge numbers, no shmup does, but better than most. It's getting a lot more coverage than the average shmup. It's got that nostalgic PS1 influence that's popular right now. It's pretty approachable, and it's got women with short hair. And most reviewers don't really get into the weeds like this. You don't hear much about scoring, or even 1cc's, so I doubt it'll matter that the game is kind of shallow. I mean, it's getting a physical release, with a deluxe edition. What shmup gets a physical release anymore? I'll at least grant that there's not a bunch of pre-release guff about how it's gonna save this dead genre, unlike, say, Signe. Anyway, if BIRDCAGE is received and sells well, I hope Polygon Bird don't take that as a sign that they don't need to improve. If I have a silver lining, it's that shmups are about nothing if not learning from failure, and that the value is in the doing, not in having done. Shmup players, and developers, being challenge seekers, fundamentally respect the act of taking up the fight, whether it's won or not. I've seen every shmup dev and player I follow repost BIRDCAGE promos, so I know they want this game to succeed and be good, like they do for every shmup, even if it isn't right now. I really, truly do feel like an asshole making a video this long and this negative about a brand new game from a debut indie studio, this close to release. Giannis and Barry, if you're watching this, I think you're right to be proud of what you've made. I'm not being critical because I love being a hater. I'm being critical because I want the best for everyone involved, from the audience to the developers to the genre itself. And personally, me and Ice Cactus would rather have 1,000 mid-shmups from new developers, who go on to make bigger and better shmups, than yet another pseudo-satirical gambling roguelite. I wouldn't bother to make a video about any of those games, let alone one of this length and detail. Because I think Polygon Bird can learn from their mistakes, and either put together a BIRDCAGE Black Label, or get to work on a sequel that's far better than their first try. May you attain enlightenment. And, this time, get real shmup players as testers on your game. They are available, and they do want to help. I like the Infinite Review, but I don't think Owen's the guy you want.
Like many Shmup fans, I am a fraud.
I like Dread Delusion, but I don't think James Ragg is the guy you want. Call up Jamers, he's Scottish. He'll do playtesting. He did on Blue Revolver. Come to think of it, Danbo is also Scottish? He can help too? All he's doing is making fucking Scrandle. Why are all the Shmup fans Scottish? Do you guys just have a lot of really good arcades over there? The moral of the story is, don't give me review codes. I am a dickhead.